Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Bauer, and it's my pleasure to chair today's Scottish Farm Advisory Service webinar entitled Brexit, What Now? The webinar is going to be interactive. We're keen to answer your question as best we can and run a few polls on key questions. To check that everyone can hear us clearly and knows how to use the question function, I'd like you to all use the question function to tell us one thing that you'd like to get out of this webinar. And by all means, use the question function to tell us that you're having any problems and we'll try and resolve those. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is an opportune moment to talk about Brexit. We're 4.5 days away from Brexit, and it's been a long time coming. We are here thanks to the Scottish Farm Advisory Service, which is funded by the Scottish Government and the European Union. And we are hoping that today will allow us to take the benefits from some of the experts at SRUC and SEC Consulting and get their insights into what they think Brexit will mean for Scottish agriculture in the coming months and years. Joining us today is Stephen Thompson, an agricultural economist with SRUC, that's Scotland's Rural College, and he's joined by Julian Bell, Kev Bevan, Chloe McCulloch, and myself from SEC Consulting. As I said earlier, our aim is to explain to you what will change on the 1st of February, what won't change on the 1st of February, what will happen over the course of the year and what the likely impact will be on agriculture, and what support is out there to help you prepare for those changes. Before we give the floor, so to speak, to our speakers, I'd like to run our first poll. A simple one to begin with, using the polling function. We'd like to ask you, what is the main focus of your business? You can pick only one of 5 choices, I'm afraid. That's the limitations of the technology. But please let us know now, using the polling function, what is the main focus of your business? This is so we have a bit more of an insight of who's on the call today. Open that now, and hopefully the votes will come in. Okay. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our first speaker. This is Stephen Thompson. Stephen's an agricultural economist from SRUC, as I said. He's around SRUC, considered the man in the know about Brexit. So it's really good to have Stephen on the call today. So Stephen, the floor is yours to give us the view from space, perhaps, the very high level view of what Brexit will mean in the coming months and years.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Stephen, and I'm an agricultural economist that works within SRUC and also doing a lot of stuff on Brexit and CAP for the Scottish Government. And I'm going to really deal with some of the high level issues, some of the timelines that we're now dealing with, and some of the sort of the things that you need to look forward or look for as we move forward through time. Brexit's been a long time happening, as you're all aware, and the only thing that really changes on the 1st of February 2020 is that we're now on a ticking clock. So once the EU ratify the withdrawal agreement, it becomes an international treaty. The UK will have to pay the Brexit bill, and we will then be in a period of transition for a year. So the 31st of January we leave. There is an EU intergovernmental meeting late in February, where they will be setting out their positioning with regards to negotiating with the EU, and the expectation is that the trade deal negotiations will start in earnest on the 1st of March 2020. Within the withdrawal agreement, there was a space for an EU-UK summit in June 2020. This is the last time that the UK will be able to request an extension to the transition period. The maximum extension would be a 2-year deadline. That would take us to 31st of December 2020. The inklings are that won't happen, with the Prime Minister saying that he will not request that. Whether this is a trade or a negotiating tactic, nobody's quite clear of yet. and come June 2020, if things aren't progressing as quickly as they may, as both parties may want, there could well be an extension requested. If we do request that extension, the UK will have to pay into the EU in terms of the budgetary contributions for 2 years. The 26th of November is the next sort of major deadline. The EU have said that in order to get a deal through the EU institutions, everything must be ratified and translated into all different languages by the 26th of November for any deal to take place by the 31st of December. And the final date that everybody should be aware of is the 31st of December 2020, where it is literally deal or no deal, unless the extension has been asked. And if there's a deal, then we will continue trading probably relatively freely with the EU in terms of non-tariff barriers, or in terms of tariff barriers. And if we don't have a deal, we will then be on a hard Brexit, which is a no-deal Brexit, trading under WTO terms. So those are the key timelines that everybody needs to be aware of. By June 2020, we should be getting a heads up on whether a deal is looking likely in this period. If there's an extension, then we can probably breathe a bit easier. All parties are saying that it's going to be a real push to get this trade deal done in the space, in the time frame that has been allocated. And whilst this is going on, of course, there's meant to be EU, UK, US trade negotiations going on at the same time, in the same time frame as what's been offered. It's a continuing puzzle, the whole Brexit conundrum, in terms of EU workers, not just for farming, but more importantly, probably for the food supply chain, and our significant reliance on them. And there's still moves afoot to see how we actually allow workers in a post-Brexit era. Trade and tariff barriers. We certainly don't want to be paying the EU tariffs. The tariffs have been set to protect EU farmers in the EU food industry, and they've been set at a really high level in order to do so. So we have chosen to come out of a club, and the benefit of being in that club is that we don't have to pay these big tariff bills in order to export our product in there. Regulation and standards, we certainly probably won't get the regulatory bonfire that everybody talked about pre-vote to leave the EU. And now, of course, people are actually saying that we need to actually maintain and enhance the UK's regulation and standards, particularly with regards to welfare and food quality. And that would be the means of protecting the sector going forward. But the sort of stuff that's coming out of Westminster just now is that they've not put this into the new agricultural bill, sort of the rest of UK agricultural bill that's going through Parliament just now. They've not actually put those standards in as part of that just now. And then the other one is agricultural policy support and what happens post-Brexit. And of course, we've had stuff in Scotland, and the rest of the UK are actually moving ahead at quite a different pace just now with regards to the agricultural bill that's going through Westminster as of last week. And of course, in this period since the vote to leave the EU, and now we have now seen phenomenal new interest in environmental drivers of land use. And climate change emergency and biodiversity emergencies will undoubtedly face or shape some of the future agricultural support in the UK, in Scotland, and also in the EU. And we should also remember at the same time, the CAP, the EU CAP, is going through a major set of reforms at this moment, which means we're changing our agricultural policy at the same time they're changing their agricultural policy support. And whether there will be a change in the balance of distribution of monies is got to be seen, but they're currently talking about things like a cap, an absolute cap on support at €100,000. There's also been mention of of capping within Scotland and also wider within the UK. But the new CAP actually mirrors quite closely what everybody's talking about in the UK, so we're not so far apart. 2020, there is a new piece of legislation being pushed through government just now, Westminster, and this covers all of the UK, and it's to make sure that the 2020 direct payments can actually, or have a legislative basis. Your 2020 farmers 2020 Pillar 2 payments, they get paid out of the existing rural development regulations, whereas the basic payment, your greening payments, your voluntary coupled payments, the coupled support payments, all get paid out of next year's EU 2021, the next year's EU budget. So the 2020 SAF form, the single application form, or IACS form, it comes out of next year's budget. So technically the UK is out of that. So this piece of legislation is being forced through government just now. The interesting thing is it also allows changes to be made in order for us to follow the EU, but also to increase the financial ceilings in line with Lord Bugh's recommendations for the intra-UK allocation of monies. So that means that the extra money that was required to make sure that England and Northern Ireland didn't lose out under Lord Bugh's review will be embedded within the system as we move forward. 2020, we remain a de facto EU member. We will continue trading with the EU unless we walk away from the negotiations. But post-2020, it looks like we're looking for a free trade agreement rather than a customs union or an economic relationship, a tighter economic relationship that Theresa May was after. That means that we will probably not face tariff barriers if that agreement can be met, but we will likely face some non-tariff barriers, and Kev Bevan will pick up on some of these things. The key ones being some of the sort of rules around plant health, animal health and welfare, rules of origin, etc. And a no deal, if we choose not to have a free trade agreement, or either party walks away from the negotiations at any stage, it does mean that we will face WTO tariffs for exporting into the EU. As I mentioned, these are pretty high, and the counter to that is the UK have set pretty low tariffs, meaning there's less protection for UK farmers under a no deal setting. Those tariffs have been set for 1 year, but the thing is that they've chosen not to support farming, rather they're supporting the consumer and cheaper food at the moment. The beef sector is one sector that's probably got some support, but there is quite a large quota for free entry into the UK under that one. So the key message is that everything changes, but nothing really changes on the 1st of February. There is still a lot of uncertainty out there until the finer detail of the trade negotiations are actually settled, and what that actually means for us. With regards to agricultural payments, it looks as if everything will be pretty smooth going forward until any new policies or changes to the existing policy kick in as these bills come forward. And that should be me just now, and I will pass back to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was fantastic. A good setting the scene there, high level, but with a few quite specific points in there. And I think continuing that theme of getting a bit more specific, I'd like to welcome Kev Bevan. Kev is a consultant with SAC Consulting and is going to give us a view from slightly closer to the ground. So Kev, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, yeah, most of the discussion over the past couple of years has been very much fixed on what the new trade arrangement will be with the EU. We're now at a stage, though, that we're now aware that we are Brexiting, so attention will focus much more towards what the policy framework, long-term policy framework, will move to. So that's what I want to pick up on here in the next 5 minutes. So yeah, so the key question is, effectively, we will not be in the CAP once we leave Europe. So what's going to replace it? Now, there has been consultations offered up by all the home countries. Scotland's was in 2018 with the Simplicity and Stability document. Now, the result from that is effectively that Scotland has adopted a kind of largely unchanged position through to probably 2024. Quite understandable, given that there was a great deal of uncertainty over whether we would Brexit or not. Now, obviously, in the last couple of months, we know that we are Brexiting at the end of this week. So what will eventually replace the cap obviously becomes a real priority. Now, in terms of shaping what the cap, what the farm rural policy will be in Scotland in the medium term, we've got to look to the kind of the guiding principles as set down by the WTO, and where we talk of what's in the green box. If we have a look at the detail here, these are the key things which are in there. And you'll note that the 4 at the top I've popped in red because those are the parts of the green box toolbox that we are using, or have been using in recent years. So we're all familiar with the basic payment scheme, etc., which under decoupled support, and obviously environmental programs through the likes of EECS. You'll see down the bottom there are other ones, though, where we haven't ventured into, but they are potentially there for us to use if we wish. The key point we want to get across, though, is where we are actually at the moment, we're in a good starting point. Basically, we are green box compliant at the moment. So there's no need for any knee-jerk reaction at this immediate point in time. So the time period of looking to 2024, and indeed, as England has suggested, even 2027, we are looking at quite a long potential transit period. So we're starting from a good position. But, and there is a few very big buts we've got to take into account. In particular, what actual trade policy will be agreed, not just with the EU, but with other countries, in particular, the kind of super agri exporters. If we think of South America, Australasia, North America, the long-term agreements with those countries will be key, because we, the UK, are a massive importer, a massive market for food. So they're very interested in that respect. A key point here is, under a worst case scenario, the kind of policy mix that the Scottish Government would need to come up with might well be very different to if we have a softer Brexit, one more akin to, and end up with a trade relationship quite similar to what it currently is. There's real concern in particular if we have a hard Brexit, and in terms of the beef and sheep sectors, because they're especially vulnerable because of the high dependency on subsidies. One of the other key buts is budgetary constraints. If we look back over the last kind of cap period, 2014-20, it's basically averaged roughly £600 million per year. That's a lot of money, but obviously within the context of all the other demands on the Scottish Exchequer, then that will undoubtedly be a factor that comes into shaping future rural agricultural policy. And the final biggie is how we actually work within a common UK policy framework. If you, of course, know that we are leaving the EU single market, but we are very much still within a UK single market, and there's considerable uncertainty about what will happen with respect to that. and we have already got quite a clear steer from what's likely to happen in England, where, for instance, the consensus seems to be that the basic payment, decoupled payment, will be phased out, and most of funding will go for public goods in terms of the likes of agri-environmental schemes. So how Scotland will be able to work within that, for instance, given that we still have coupled payments, the only in terms of calf scheme and the sheep scheme, how that fits within a UK framework is yet to be seen. So that's my point, but obviously we'll gladly take any questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Kev. That's very helpful as well. Who knew that the green box was going to come to be so important to Scottish agriculture? It's probably a terminology that many people will not be that familiar with, but it's certainly going to be racing up people's consciousnesses in the next wee while. I'd like to invite Julian now, the last of our presenters today. This is Julian Bell. Julian's a consultant with SEC Consulting as well, and Julian's going to give us the view from much closer to the ground, the view in the field, what this means for farm businesses in Scotland in the short term, and maybe looking a little bit further ahead if Julian's crystal ball is really functioning today.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to home in on the crop sector and a few potential things to consider, certainly the industry are aware of at the moment. Now, the good thing is that we have a bit of stability this year, at least to the end of the year. And this come December, the 31st of December, we're not entirely sure what the trade position will be after that, but at least up until the 31st of December, it seems apparent that certainly trade with the EU will be unaffected. Now, in terms of the crop sector, the big export period of the year for the UK anyway is the autumn, and so 2019 was a bit disruptive because there was a potential period where we could have had to finish exporting by the 31st of October, given the no deal potential that was there. So we have those extra couple of months. So that's good for the cereal sector, and it's actually particularly good for the potato sector because most of the seed potatoes are exported in November, December. So for the crop that's coming, there's more stability than there was last year. That said, certainly for some commodities, we're going to perhaps need to increase exports beyond the Christmas period. Certainly barley, you might be aware of the conditions across, well, it was a wet autumn, particularly in England, and there's a huge area of land that's not gone into winter crops. So that is likely to go into barley. Quite a lot of that is going to have to be exported. So the wheat area is perhaps down. But the point is, barley is actually more problematic. The EU is one of the main markets, and if there's no deal come the 31st of December, the default trade restraints into the EU do not favour barley. So that could create some issues. We would have to go for third country markets. So to sum, this year there is more stability than last year, but there are some issues with one or two commodities. What's clearly of more concern is what happens after the 31st of December. There's one critical thing is if we do completely leave the EU, the customs union, etc. on that date, the UK government, as Stephen mentioned, has reduced the protection from third country imports, and in certain terms of all of the crops, in fact, it's zero. So we could be opening up to new sources of grains and other imports into the UK. So that is one change. And as I say, if we have issues around exporting to the EU after the 31st of December, Seed potatoes do have issues because we require phytosanitary equivalents to be agreed with the EU. Now, that sort of thing there's a risk to that if there's not a coherent deal agreed with the EU, because it's clearly in our mutual interest to reciprocate with each other's plant health arrangements. But if talks break down, then that could be a risk to around 20% of our seed potato exports. The third countries, they're dependent on bilateral agreements, some of which are through the EU. So there are some concerns. Some of the bigger markets, there's more confidence that even in the absence of a deal with the EU, that we will they have an advantage or benefit from continuing to trade with the UK. So there's hope and there's time to renegotiate that. Now, on the final couple of points, what's been coming out of certainly recent meetings and with the cereal industry is that this whole position creates uncertainty for everybody, and actually local growers, local farmers can actually guarantee supply and meet standards and things like that for the local processing industry. And we are seeing a growth in producer groups working closely to supply exactly what the processors want, whether that's be in oats, in whiskey, or other sectors. And I think that's an opportunity for farmers to get closer to the end user. Yes, there's a risk that grain and other commodities will be able to come into the UK with less restriction, but what you tend to find is that whichever part of the world has a surplus can vary from one year to the next. So to a processor to rely too much on imports is actually quite risky. So I think that is an opportunity for farmers to work together and assure supply. So they were some of the main things I was going to cover. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. Right, so you've heard from our three experts there, the view from a very high level, somewhere well above the earth, and that was Stephen. Kev brought it a little bit closer to home, and Julian's given us the real practical stuff in the short term. What I'd like to do now is really turn the floor over to all of you who are listening to get your view on what you're hearing, to pose any questions that you have. We've had a few come in already, so I'll kick off with some of them. But please use the question function as we're going to put in anything that's on your mind. I'm very conscious that we've got three people here who are very knowledgeable about the subject, but please don't see that as a barrier to ask the question that you think, oh, well, I should know that already, because I think this is such a complex and fluid situation that there is really, to use that phrase, no such thing as a daft question here. This is really fundamentally complex, and therefore, we'd really rather people got it off their chest and we were able to give them the best answer we can. So a question that's been posed online has been a point asking for clarification if there are likely to be delays at ports for imports and exports as of Friday. And I think some people will be aware of some of the issues here, the significance of some ports to the UK trade, but I'll turn that over to our three speakers and ask them to clarify what they think the position is going to be and whether or not they think that will evolve over time as well. Who's going to put themselves up to answer that one?
Well, just quickly, there's no question about trade with the EU continuing, so that's a vast bulk of trade. There is a question mark over a few potential countries outside the EU and whether they will honour the bilateral agreements that we've enjoyed through the EU. And it's actually quite hard to be sure. Some have signed agreements with the UK government. Others have indicated that they won't cause any headaches with that. But it remains the risk that one or two countries decide to change their import terms for UK products. So far, we're not clear that there's going to be any problems, but it's one of those things we may not know for sure until a few days into trade. But it's only specific products and it's not the bulk of the trade, so I don't see a major problem, but there's a bit of an uncertainty there.
And could I just get clarification out of my own interest here? I've heard mention that the port of Rotterdam has particular significance for European agriculture, never mind UK agriculture. Could you maybe explain what the issue is there?
Yeah, that's kind of the Rotterdam effect, where it's such a major port of entry and exit into the EU that a lot of product descends on Rotterdam and then dissipates throughout the EU. And of course, up until now, that's been pretty free movement, or it has been free movement for the UK. So that won't change perhaps immediately. As Julian says, it's slightly clouded with the countries that haven't signed up to bilateral agreements. And the most noteworthy was that Canada have turned around and said that they think that their terms of trade with UK have changed, so they wouldn't roll over the deal with the EU have with Canada. So we're already seeing trade partners taking a slightly different approach to how they deal with the United Kingdom in terms of the scale of the market and market opportunities for their product. So for a Scottish perspective, seed potato, we know a lot of the seed potato that leaves Scotland goes through Rotterdam and then ends up in Egypt or Morocco. And how that is dealt with going forward will be one of those touchy issues with regards to plant health rules and phytosanitary rules that will be part of the wider trade negotiations. But I would reiterate what Julian says, as of the 1st of February, there shouldn't be too many delays in our ports, because we are still a de facto EU member whilst this negotiation goes on.
Yeah, can I just pick up on that as well? I think the key point here is that by and large there isn't any notable changes at the moment, as Stephen set out at the beginning. The greater concern with non-tariff measures and all these things like inspections at ports, export certification, etc., is that the preparation is in place for potentially the 1st of January next year. Now, it's not many months until then, and I think it needs to be emphasised that a free trade agreement is on the spectrum, is quite far towards the hard Brexit end of the spectrum. And under that situation, even if we end up with zero tariffs and zero quotas, non-tariff measures are likely to play a very important role and could be a showstopper in terms of some of the trade that we will be doing. The other one to bring into mind here, which is quite close to home, is how things will work with Ireland and Northern Ireland, because effectively, unless we signed up to something like a customs union, and it seems pretty clear that we're not heading towards that, then there will be inspections or checks in trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There's been a lot of bluff about that, but effectively, as it currently stands, that's what's likely to happen.
Okay, thank you all for your contributions there. Questions come from online here. I think this will be one that would be a very common question if we were out on farm, would be what might sheep producers see happening this year? I think you've all suggested that the change is not going to be overnight, but again, I know we're relying a little bit on our crystal balls here, but yours are a bit better tuned and informed than a lot of the rest of us. So what would you expect to see happening for sheep producers in the next year or so?
Well, if I pick up on that, basically, dare I say, a lot more certainty in 2020 than there was in 2019 lamb crop. If you remember, we were looking to leave the end of March last year, then the end of October, which created considerable problems for producer and processor and retailer during that year. For this year, basically, most people will probably have most of their lambs sold before the end of December, if we are at that point moving to a free trade agreement. So for this year, I suspect people who buy store lambs to finish them for after Christmas, whether that's for the domestic market or for the export market, they're probably will have the main direct concern. But apart from that, the obvious major question is that in terms of the 2021 lamb crop, whether that will have access to the big EU market, which we're very dependent on, or not. So, so for 2020 lamb crop, relatively clear what's likely to happen. But for 2020 beyond that is very unclear, and we possibly won't really know until after the TUPs have gone in the autumn.
Okay, thank you. That's
Andrew, I would just add that that's where keeping an eye on these negotiations and trade negotiations as to where we are is vital for this, because, as I said, the EU have set a pretty hard deadline for end of November for everything to be ratified and in legislation for them to get it through Parliament and the Council. So sort of by the end of November, we should pretty much know what the situation is. And of course, if the UK choose to go down the extension route, we would know probably in June what that extension period is, which would give people a bit more certainty. And the other thing that we also have to acknowledge is that there's global issues at play here as well in terms of protein, and the Chinese market is hoovering up protein for all types of different sources just now. And Australia are short of lambs for drought reasons. So global markets actually are playing into probably our hands slightly as well on all of this.
Okay, yeah, a good reminder that Brexit is not the only game in town, however significant it is. So, somebody online here posing I suppose trying to elicit the positive side of this situation. Other than an increase in producer groups, are there any other positives or opportunities in the markets that you can see as a result of Brexit?
I'll start there and say yes. Our trade negotiations may indeed come up with future opportunities. Brexit is highly disruptive. When there's disruption, the status quo kind of goes out the window, and people will find new opportunities. Obviously, some people will feel a bit of hurt as well at certain times, but new opportunities for trading internationally may well appear. Feed products may indeed reduce in price as well. But the key thing here, and again, if you go back to sheep, is that we may need to look at how we process if we want to enter into certain markets. So currently, Scotland doesn't really do halal. So if we were wanting to enter into the Middle East market where you've got a high premium product, then we would have to perhaps change the way we process. So there's a whole series of things that may need to be done. And people seem to think quite often that free trade arrangements simply would mean that we can simply trade on the same terms that we trade with the EU or within the EU. And of course, examples, if you look at free trade arrangements around the world just now, is that actually trading with some of these other countries is actually quite challenging because of labeling requirements and other regulatory requirements that they have. So it's not always easy, but if we can get into these opportunities, I mean, if you think about sheep again, the American market is small per capita, but it's a huge market. in terms of sheep meat. So if we could get sheep meat into those kind of markets and beef products, then we surely can be on a winner. But it may take an awful lot of investment to break into these markets in any kind of scale, rather than just on the periphery.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's useful information there. Sorry, somebody else wanted to dive in?
I mean, even if there's a free trade agreement with the EU, there's going to be more friction and delay in getting stuff across the border, and paperwork and cost. I think the study suggests that it was sort of between 3 and 7%, something like that. And it kind of and the timing is critical as well. So products that traveling into the UK will spend longer getting here, and that reduces their shelf life. So in a way, it creates a bit more incentive for local supply, especially fresh produce, fresh products. So, you know, you would think there might be some scope for increasing local sourcing in some parts of agriculture.
And on that one, on Julian's point there about local, is that we all should remember that the declared climate emergency, the consumer is actually some consumers are actually starting to think about their consumption patterns as well. So there may well be greater opportunity for more local food or UK or Scottish food consumption.
Okay, I'm going to stop that one there, if you don't mind, gentlemen, because the questions are flooding in and I want to try and get them through them all. Another question online: is there a sense of the workforce implications of Brexit in the short and long term, specifically EU citizens currently working in the farm and processing sectors?
I'll maybe pick up on that one. The answer is no, we don't really know. We were involved in looking at the seasonal migrant worker in Scottish agriculture a couple of years ago for the Scottish Government, where pretty much the 90%, 95% of the horticulture sector seasonal workers were from the EU, mostly from Bulgaria and Romania. We did a follow-up last year with some of the major producers, and things were starting to get challenging from them then, in so much that they hadn't, this year's workers, 2020 workers, weren't signing up because of Brexit uncertainties. Some of them were having to spend an awful lot more on recruitment. The Association of Labour Providers, they do an annual survey which suggests that they're unable to fulfil farmers' requirements as and when they need them. Speaking to one of the Association of Labour Providers, he was saying that it's increasingly difficult to meet the just-in-time needs and demands that farmers are having. So they're focusing more on forward contracts, basically, with regards to their workforce. For the wider supply chain, it's one of the bigger concerns I personally have, is that we have a huge reliance on EU workers within the food supply chain, whether that's the official vets, whether it's the meat processing, whether it's the chicken catchers or chicken sexers, or across the entire sector. And of course, it depends really on how Brexit plays out in terms of settled status, and in terms of how people actually perceive, in terms of how they perceive living in the UK in the longer term. The SAWS scheme, the feedback has been that it's been useful for those that are in it. For those that haven't been able to really get into it, it's been not very helpful, full stop. The government seem reticent to try and increase the numbers through that for whatever reason. So yes, there are lots of challenges, and I can't really see the light at the end of the tunnel, other than the 30,000 that the Migratory Advisory Committee had set, the 30,000 salary limit. They've rescinded on that, so that's one positive for the sector going forward.
Okay, thank you. Another question: with Scotland looking to achieve net zero by 2030, when is there going to be more confirmed policy proposals like a Scotland Ag Bill?
technically, there is a Scotland Ag Bill just now. Unfortunately, for that purpose, it's not about a new set of principles. This bill is currently about making tweaks, possibly simplification tweaks, to the existing CAP. So in order for us to evolve the CAP, and when I gave evidence in Parliament, and the MSPs were quite strong on this, is that the existing bill, or the bill that's going through Parliament just now, should be time bound, and that we probably need to set something up with new principles sooner rather than later. And if you remember, stability and simplicity was, that consultation was, what, 2 years ago now, and of course the climate emergency has been declared since then, and there's an increasing focus in Scottish Government on meeting those objectives. So I'm not sure about their timelines. Certainly the UK, or the DEFRA agriculture bill that's been placed before Parliament, is putting a priority on environment and public goods, and that may necessitate the Scottish Government to react quicker, in terms of, instead of 2024 being the sort of transition period, we may need to start thinking sooner.
Yeah, can I just add to that, because it's interesting. England have been very clear on where they are looking to go. Now remember that England, and indeed Wales, morphed their LFAS payment, or their equivalent, into their agri-environmental schemes. I think England probably best part of 10 years ago, and Wales 4 or 5 years ago. Scotland still has the LFAS. And so, as I said earlier on, there's an overall budget, and within that green box, it's how we shape those particular schemes, like a decoupled payment, like public goods payments. That will be largely up to the Scottish Government to formulate now. Now, England have been quite clear on where they're going with their ELMS scheme. But one word of warning on that, as the National Audit Office down in London reported back on ELMS, and they identified a lot of nitty-gritty detail on what was not happening with that, in terms of how do you practically make such a scheme work. And that is really one of the key questions, because it's pretty clear that public goods in all of the home countries is going to be increasingly important. But it's how we design those schemes to not just work, but actually achieve the outcomes is going to be crucial. And that's where a lot of debate is going to go in the coming months.
Yeah, the devil in the detail, absolutely. Second to last question here, and then we'll move towards the end. Second last question is, in the event of a no deal at the end of December, is it likely that mini deals will be made to keep essential trade going, and would sheep meat be likely to be one of these mini deals?
Mini deals technically can't happen, so you can't pick and choose which aspects to trade with. So if we had a mini deal with the EU on sheep meat, that would mean that every single country that's part of the WTO must be offered those same terms. So it's not very easy to pick and choose certain sectors over anything else, just the way that the WTO rules currently exist. Of course, Donald Trump's trying his best to probably get rid of the WTO, but there's an awful lot of resistance against that. So I don't think mini deals will occur.
Okay. Right.
That's my view.
Yeah. I don't know whether Kev or Julian wish to contradict you, but it sounds like that's a fairly firm no there.
Certainly would agree.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Last question here, and a good one to finish on is, what, and maybe we can take it in turn here. What would you recommend Scottish farmers, the one thing that they should be focusing on right now to be best prepared for Brexit? So maybe we can start with you, Kev. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to go, and this picks up on the point a few questions back about the positives. And at the end of the day, as farmers, you're producers. So which links very nicely neatly to productivity. And must we remember that within the green box, there's opportunities to improve the productivity of our agriculture. Remember, the reason why most of these countries, like the South Americans, America, Australasia, want to get into the UK market is it's a massive food market. So basically, we are right next to it. And as Julian said, there's a whole lot of advantages of being close by. And really, so there's a lot to emphasize there. So the key point then is basically improving our performance, profitability, productivity will be key, whichever sector you're in, whilst at the same time, of course, being very aware of the importance of the environment, which will be more important in some parts of the country than others. But it's been business alert to take advantage and work to that kind of future. So producing for the marketplace, whether that's the environment or the production of malt and barley.
Thank you, Kev. Julian, could you give us your one priority that you'd give to Scottish farmers to focus on?
Speak to your buyers and identify what they need, whether there might be opportunities to help them, whether whatever's coming, and there might be risks. So you might want to diversify. So find out what your existing buyers want and understand what might affect those markets, so you can at least be aware of any risks in entry into sort of supply agreements.
Excellent. And Stephen, the last word to you in the Q&A.
I would say flexibility. We are in a period of change, and as Kev has alluded to, productivity will be a driver. Scottish Government are showing quite a lot of policy interest in how do we improve productivity, and that's driven partially by climate change, but also to increase profitability. The flexibility in the uplands will be maybe changing the way you look upon how you're farming to perhaps more environmentally, I wouldn't say more environmentally friendly, but more climate friendly practices, and using the opportunities that policy will undoubtedly provide for upland farming and lowland farming as we move forward. I think it's pretty clear from the Scottish Government policy perspective that they see agriculture as an important aspect of the rural economy, more so than we've had from signals in England and Wales perhaps. And that means that I think policy will evolve to be as productive as possible in Scottish agriculture, and also meeting our environmental and climate change commitments. So flexibility.
Yeah, some good messages there, all three. Thank you very much. We've got a few things to do before we conclude this webinar, and one of them neatly follows on from that last question there. Chloe McCullough is going to give us a bit of an overview now of what resources are on the FAS website to help businesses adapt, take advantage of the opportunities to be flexible, and that she's also going to highlight some of the one-to-one funding that's available there. Chloe.
Thanks, Andrew. There are lots of resources and sources of support available through the Farm Advisory Service. All of the information is on the website, which is what you can see just now. That's www.fas.scot. I'll make that a bit bigger. So you can see it better. To get information about grants, if you go to this section here on advice and grants, and as well as the normal integrated land management plan, that's the ILMP, where up to £2,500, £3,200 of funding is available. Every business can apply for some resilience planning advice. So there's £1,000 of funding available. You don't need to have done an ILMP already, and this plan would involve an expert advisor reviewing your business and helping you develop a resilience action plan. There's also information about applying for that here on the website if you go into specialist advice area there. But if you need any help, you can phone the helpline on 0300 323 0161. We also have a variety of Brexit related information on the FAST website. If you go into rural business on the homepage and then go down to Brexit, lots of these resources are looking forward to post-Brexit. For instance, we have an A to Z of post-Brexit trade, and this includes information about lots of the terminology and concepts that you might encounter. We've spoken about some of these today. We also on the Brexit website have quite a lot of sector-specific information. So we've got some specific technical information for dairy farmers. We've got some sector summaries which look at how what the impacts might be and what the opportunities might be for some sectors. And finally, if you scroll down to the bottom, you will get publications which include related podcasts, news, articles and items that are added regularly. And right down at the bottom, you will get related events. But it's very much a growing resource. There's information being added daily, so do check back regularly. Don't forget the other areas of the FAST website. There's lots of information on there. For instance, in business tools, we have information on everything from digital security to employing people to the tenants improvements amnesty. So there's loads of information on the website. If you would like help or advice and can't find what you're looking for, don't forget that you can call the helpline. So 0300 323 0161. They will be able to help you find what you're looking for. And if it's not something that's on the website, they'll be able to direct you to a consultant who'll be able to help you. I think that's all I wanted to say.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chloe. That's been a very interesting discussion for me. I hope you've all found it very useful as well. Before we finish, I'd like to pose you a few questions or a few things that we'd like to know a little bit more about. So you've taken part in this webinar. A simple question now. Do you feel that you now better understand the risks and opportunities Brexit poses to your business in the coming 2 years? We'd be really keen to know your thoughts on that, so please do vote now. I'll leave that up there at the moment. Whilst you're considering your answers and voting, we'd like you to, if you have not got the answers that you were looking for today, then please send us a question now using the online question tool, or drop us an email through the FAS website and pose us any question you want, and we'll do our very best to answer it. We're going to take the questions that have been asked today and any that we receive subsequently, and we're going to create a Q&A document that we'll put on the FAS website soon. So you'll see this, as well as a recording of this podcast, this webinar, online in the next few days, I would hope. But in the meantime, I'd just like to thank Kev and Stephen and Julian for their insights. I'd like to thank Chloe for organising the webinar and signposting us all to the resources that are available on the FAS website. And I'd like to thank you all for taking part. Thank you very much, and goodbye.